Okay, the floor is yours.
Otherwise, I'll just
Okay.
Here, how the here, 4 examples. Okay, thank you very much.
I will start. Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you for the space to present this. I was about to say paper, but I must say that this presentation does not have a paper behind it because there are no results associated to this. It is really a research proposal. So we had the idea with Michalis to come here, present the idea and get your feedback. Okay. And our idea with this project is to really combine our relative expertise. And what we want to do is to take advantage of all the latest innovations and developments in the empirical measurement of economic inequality into macroeconomic models, and specifically stock flow models. Why? Because all of these innovations in the empirical measurement of inequality are and have moved in the last decade in that stock flow perspective. Okay, so at last we finally seem to have some data to be able to incorporate into stock flow consistent models, which are ideal for the purposes. So I'm just going to motivate the idea, historically motivate the idea of integrating distributional data into stock flow models, talk a bit about our ideas of design of the FSC models, and very briefly on what we would like to do with them. Okay, so let's give some historical context. So, when we think about macroeconomic statistics and the framework for national accounts, which have been developed with a series of revisions since the first system of national accounts in 1953, all the way until the latest official version of 2008. I mean, this sets the framework for what gets counted as production, income, and everything else that you know. And this is some of national accounts, detailed the framework for thinking about the aggregates, okay, for the economy as a whole. But from the very beginning, it's interesting that if you go to the very early pioneers of national accounting in the US, we look at the work of the early MBER under the leadership of Wesley Clare Mitchell and his disciple, notably Simon Kuznets, they started thinking about aggregates and measuring aggregates alongside their distributions. Okay, so Wesley Clare Mitchell wrote influential works on business cycles and the empirical measurement of business cycles, and Kuznets was a pioneer in the early national accounting, official national accounts in the US, national income and its compositions, sectoral compositions in 1941, and the influential 1953 work on measuring the shares of upper income groups, income and savings. So from the very beginning, there was a distribution element, not only sectoral distribution, but also household distribution, which got forgotten once the first system of national accounts got adopted at the global level. Okay, they left aside the personal or the household distribution. That was a big focus of the early MBR. And Kuznets is a pioneer in the recent inequality literature with Piketty et al. He's often considered as the father of modern distribution in national accounting, but actually, in a recent paper I wrote on Keynes' vision, it's really Keynes's How to Pay for the War that's, I argue, the first, modern exercise in distributional national accounting. Okay? with a with a statistician from Cambridge. It's also to distinguish, the effects, the changes in incomes and savings and taxes across different income groups in population. Okay, to answer this question. Okay, so again, it's distributional national accounting has a long history, and in the work that I've been involved with, okay, with co-authors, they've started to rethink, if you like, re-examine and reconceptualize distributional national accounts at the global level. Okay, the World Inequality Database, the World Inequality Lab, basically has these guidelines, okay, which is basically taking the framework of the national accounts, the aggregates, and seeking to distribute GDP, national income, and all the subcomponents. Okay, that's the idea. Okay, and the latest guidelines are from last year, and they can be accessed through the World Inequality Database. Okay, so this is a huge collective work that's inspired by Kuznets and others. Started in 2016, the guidelines, and have continued. Again, like the official national accounts guidelines, the idea is to provide a guidelines to explain how to arrive at these empirical measures. And why is this important? So what these guidelines explain is how to distribute nationally to households. All national income gets distributed to households. That's the idea. The firm's corporate balance, the government balance, everything in the end gets distributed to households, so that you have the top 1% is the top 1% of net national income. Now, a lot of inequality research, even that continues, relies on micro data to measure inequality. There's an issue here because, as is well known, microeconomic data does not measure the full extent of national income. If we take, for example, the case of the US and look at labor income, this comes from the 60 size and Zuckman distribution national account data for the US. And they show that taking just administrative monetary fact data, wages and self-employment income, all labor income in the national accounts is about 70% of national income. But what appears in microeconomic statistics is less than that. So you have a gap of about a quarter of national labor income that is missing in microeconomic statistics. Tax data. If you look at surveys, the gap is bigger, because surveys, especially where they're not registered or not linked to registered data, which is not really the case in the US, but for other countries, the gaps can be a lot larger. So a quarter of a gap for labor income. If you look at capital income and you look at microeconomic statistics, what you see, the dividends, interest, and rents, profit reported on this is much smaller than the aggregate capital income, which is about 30%, a third, okay, of national income. But what we see in micro statistics is there's a missing 2/3 gap, okay, with respect to capital income, which is more highly concentrated than labor income, as we know. This is not only a case in the US, all countries have these data gap issues. In research we've done on Latin America, we take stock of these gaps, these data gaps, and the implications for inequality measurements. And of course, the purpose is that where we have gaps, we have to ask ourselves the question, if we want to close the gap, will that make countries more unequal? Or if we don't believe the gap, it means that we have to take the conclusion that countries are not as rich as reported in the national accounts. So there's this conundrum. And what we find when we seek to recover this gap for 10 Latin American economies is, of course, inequality rises a lot. But let me just show you few more details on these gaps for 2 countries in Latin America, so Brazil and Mexico. So here you have the situation, you have national income, which is divided in the shaded areas, the national income that goes associated to the government, corporations, and the household sector in blue. And what we plot is the total income that's reported in microeconomic statistics, either household surveys around dots, or in tax data or other admin data on wages. And what you can see is that there are large gaps between microeconomic statistics that have been typically used to measure inequality and the macroeconomic statistics. So roughly half of national income is captured in microeconomic statistics. And there's a reason why the gap is large. There's obviously conceptual differences, but even if you just focus on household sector income, there's still a large gap, okay, between what's measured in micro statistics and what's in macro statistics, okay? And it has been an old preoccupation in the literature. You can go back to Oscar Altini's article from 1987 that talks about the problem, these gaps and the problems for understanding of inequality and growth. Right up 30 years later, there's Dennis Dixter and Eto's article on the US and the problems with these gaps, okay? And it's only really since in the last decade that we've made more consistent efforts in trying to bridge the gap so that we can fully distribute if you like, the sequence of macroeconomic accounts to the households. And accompanying our efforts at the World Inequality Lab has also been other global stakeholders. So the Eurostat and specifically the OECD have been leading projects to basically bridge these gaps and have a set of distributional national accounts. Okay, but for income, okay, the 2025 guideline, and also ongoing for wealth. Okay, with expert groups that have met and defined guidelines for how to do so in a similar way to the World Inequality Lab guidelines. And you also have the BEA in the US and the Fed that carries its that performs distributional financial accounts, the ECB likewise in Europe. And basically the move with all of this is to go from experimental statistics that already exist in some country national websites to official statistics of what, not just GDP and national income, but the distribution of GDP of national income across the size distribution of income and wealth. Okay, that's the goal. And this goal is emerging into the new system of national accounts, 2025. So this is the new revision and the draft of pre-edit that's available on the UN website and on all the other stakeholders. So it's in these guidelines where, from these guidelines, we're going to see the emergence of official statistics on basically the national accounts, the aggregates distributed, okay, according to income and wealth distributions. And if you go to chapter 34 of these guidelines, you'll see there's a chapter on measuring well-being and measuring material well-being. We basically have outlines of the system of national accounts, the aggregates of the production account, the distribution of income account, capital account, and so on, across sectors. So this is what has existed, for the last, 70 years. And now the novelty of the new revision, where you're the same aggregates distributed here according to income DC. What all countries are going to be engaged in producing in the next years, which is exciting because it will give us more data to be able to include inequality variables in, for example, stock flow models, which are very well paid to this structure. Okay, so how are we thinking about it? And we have with Michalis been thinking a lot about this. One way that I like to approach it is, well, for the object of empirical distributional stock flow consistent models, we have sectoral balances. This is the case for the US, which is well known. And so private sector balance, it's an aggregate, right? So one objective is to decompose this aggregate, because we know, for example, even in 2025, the private sector as a whole has a surplus. That does not mean that all household groups have surpluses in the economy. So if we decompose this for different household groups, bottom, middle, top, how will that look? Okay, and building, that's the sort of starting point for thinking about these type of statistics. So to use distributional national accounts, if you like, to decompose the private balance, lending and borrowing, which will give us a lot of very interesting, stylized facts and information for thinking about a lot of problems to do with financial instability and so on that I'll come back to. So let's take a look at what the design of a simple two-sector model would look like that would be equivalent to the guidelines of distributional national accounts that have been constructed. Okay, so we have the rest of the world government production sector, and the household sector is split in three, with the bottom 50%, the middle 40% in the distribution, and the top 10% in the distribution. Okay, and then we have the items on expenditure, on income, wages, and profits, of each household group, and then the net lending items. Okay, this is the decomposition of the private sector balance, and then the link to stock and wealth. And the good thing about distribution national accounts is that it's a framework that is stock flow consistent by definition. So we can have data on the distribution of income and the distribution of wealth and their linkages. Okay, so this is a simple three-sector model that we think is going to be our first, the first design we're going to explore empirically and to calibrate with the data that exists. But there are numerous challenges because we still don't have a complete distribution of data on a lot of items, something that I could come back to. So on individual income, we have statistics broken down by wages and profits, transfers, taxes, even wealth subcomponents, but the distribution of private expenditures, consumption and investment, which we aggregate here, this is still a challenge to get a distribution on this. I think this is probably I would say the main challenge I'll come back to. We've reproduced here the same just for a 5-sector model when we distinguish subs and firms, okay, financial sector and non-financial sector. This is a more complex model, more data intensive. But we're going to start with the simple model. That's the idea with this research plan. And the reason why it approximates distribution of accounts is what these accounts do is that they distribute all national income, even the corporate retained balance, even the government balance to households. Okay, so it's a more simplified approach, more catered for this type of model. Where we separate households and firms, it's going to be a lot more data intensive, and the data is not yet ready to be able to really empirically calibrate the 5-sector model, okay, distribution. But it could also potentially be done. This is something we're also exploring. Okay, so let's talk about data. So in terms of data, and we're thinking about this for the US for data reasons, because we can rely on, this is the estimates of income and wealth inequality, which are macro consistent, okay, done by Blanchet and Zuckman, building on works by Michalis and Zuckman. So this is a real-time inequality website that seeks to track in as close to real-time as possible distributions of national income and national wealth across household groups, bottom, middle, and top. And the nice thing about this data is that it uses an array of sources to produce macro consistent data. Okay, so they're using a lot of data from the DEA, the DLS, wage and admin data, wage data from admin sources, the financial accounts from the Federal Reserve, billionaire data, and of course the distribution of national accounts estimates originally from PDP size and Zuckman. And here they rely on income tax microdata, which are very precise for most of the distribution, especially the very top, combined with current population surveys and the survey to consumer finances for the very bottom. And it's a more complete approach than distribution of financial accounts of the Federal Reserve, which just rely on the survey, okay, to distribute items, not also tax. This approach here by PDP size and Zuckman is more complete, and it also feeds this database here, which is nice. Now the challenge, of course, is that there's no distribution of expenditures, private expenditures. Public expenditures there are, but there's no distribution of private expenditures. Something I'll come back to. So there's a richer way of data sources. There is a stock flow framework that uses high frequency data. So they have monthly, quarterly, and annual estimates of the income and the distributions. And it's a completely harmonized microfiles that we can use. And it must be stressed they are all macro consistent. So there are no macro data gaps. So they're fully capturing all national income and national wealth. Okay, so stock flow consistency here is just some graphs for some income, real income growth, real wealth growth over time in the US. So to feed the model, we have data on income, we have an income composition, wages, profits. We have data on wealth and different types of assets, clearly laid out. There's no distributed information on private expenditures or private consumption and investment. So to have an idea of savings, this is where it gets a bit tricky, because we can either follow two approaches. We could try and estimate a distribution of private expenditures, household consumption using surveys. That's quite straightforward. But then investments, is the distribution of investment then is going to be more challenging across across the distribution. So that would be a direct approach. An indirect approach could be inferring changes in wealth, because we have each wealth item, okay, in the distribution national accounts. So we could infer net savings from that, but then we'd have to ask about capital gains and how they're accounted for. And to the best of my knowledge, capital gains are accounted for in the wealth distributional estimates of the database. Okay, but of course they're not in the flow accounts, the flow of funds. Okay, but that's I think that's an important question that we'll get to think about. But all the ingredients, or most of the ingredients, seem to be there to be able to produce these type of models. For what purpose? Well, these ideas that with Michalis we developed for for grant applications, basically research questions like the following. So does rising economic concentration increase financial unsustainability and precipitate financial crises? And does this get exacerbated with fiscal surpluses on the government account? How? And here we take financial unsustainability as in this literature, so a growth path in which sectoral financial balances produce unstable stock flow ratios, because this would be, for example, rising asset income ratios and debt income ratios. And why are they unstable? Well, because we can relate them to a set of hypotheses, such that rising income concentration, for example, would lead to rising borrowing of middle and lower income classes, negative saving rates, and an increase in the debt income ratios with which accompanied by deleveraging and defaults can lead to credit constraints and crises. And that, mirrored by excess savings at the top and rise in their asset income ratios. The possibility of credit bubbles to emerge, which can also, combined with the lower distribution, the lower income at the middle and bottom, can lead to a lot of instability. And this can be exacerbated. This is also a question by too restrictive fiscal policy in the context of rising concentration and inequality. Okay, so this is just an example of what we could do, the questions that we could address with these type of distributional stock flow consistent models, which would be quite data intensive, but we think that given the development and the innovations in the past 10 years on the empirical measurement of inequality, we finally have the ingredients to be able to construct these type of models and answer these type of questions with a lot more reliability and confidence. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.
I don't have much of that. So
you just a slide, yeah. So any feedback is welcome.
Yes, the thing you talk about the SNA 2025. When will this be available? It's something it will take some years for the data to be publicly available.
Oh, the data, yeah, it will take some time. The guidelines, the pre-edit is already on the website, but I think the data will take time. But there are already some countries that have on their stats websites experimental statistics, so that even the OECD countries